Imagine you're in a large dugout canoe on the broad Putumayo River in Colombian jungle. It's hot on the water and muggy. You could smell the humidity and the moss rotting in the jungle along the riverbanks. There's jaguars, huge 22-foot anacondas and piranhas. I grew up there in the middle of adventures every day, but often wondering whether my parents loved me. They moved there in 1960 and raised 6 kids, and I was the oldest, while they translated the Bible into the unwritten Siona Indian language. I learned to love airplanes while flying back and forth between Loma Linda, the missionary community in central Colombia with maybe 300 Americans living there, and the jungle environment farther south along the Putumayo River, right next door to an evil witch doctor, a shaman. Now, with all the adventures and dangers my parents exposed us to, I learned to view the fear that usually accompanies danger as my body's way of telling me that an adventure is about to begin. Now, one of my earliest memories is when I was 2, on the Putumayo. Our house stood on 9-foot stilts in case of floods. It had a thatched roof and bamboo walls. Our nearest neighbor was maybe a quarter mile up or down river from us. We used a wood stove and no electricity. My job at 2 years old was to close our chicken coop door every night so the wild animals in the jungle wouldn't eat our chickens. And one night I forgot to close that door, and my parents made me go out and finish the job after dark. Our only light was a kerosene-burning hurricane lamp, and I sat on those front steps for what felt like hours, peering out underneath the house, back toward the chicken coop, which I couldn't even see, it was so dark, wondering what was going to come out of that jungle and eat me. Till finally a light clicked onto my head and my heart because I remembered a Bible verse, one of a handful that my parents even then had us memorize. This was Isaiah 12:2, and it was all about trusting and not being afraid. And with that verse running through my head and my heart, I lost all my fear, and I went out and I closed that chicken coop door. No problem. That's how my parents solved problems. You go to the Bible, you pray, and you trust God. 8 years later, I had headaches and blurred vision, so they took me into Bogota, the capital, where a doctor ran me through all kinds of tests. The diagnosis? Brain tumor. I remember those excruciating headaches. And I saw the x-rays, and I saw the way my skull was splitting open from the pressure. And my parents prayed hard. And when the doctor scheduled surgery and injected a tracer to pinpoint that tumor, my parents and everyone who knew them were praying. And the doctor couldn't find a thing. A week later, I was up again. No more headaches, without surgery. 2.5 years later, our house in the jungle needed replacing, so my dad and his friend took me and my friend and my 12-year-old brother Bob out to the jungle to build a new one. And we weren't out there a week before all 3 of us boys caught malaria. And this strain didn't respond to the standard treatment. Now, did my dad evacuate us? No, of course not. He already had experience with healing prayer, and he was on a mission from God to build that house. He and his friend prayed the whole time they built that house around the 3 of us sick boys. And when they finished, my mom came out with the younger kids, and us sick boys went back to Loma Linda on the return flight to a doctor where we recovered very quickly. There, see, the devil never stood a chance against my parents' prayers. And a year later, when I was 14, I took another friend out to the jungle. Now, Tom was fresh from the U.S. His parents were farmers from the Midwest, there to teach agriculture, and Tom had only been there for that 1 year, our freshman year of high school. And he was really cool. He even cussed. He used words like heck and darn. My parents saw that and decided to gear up our spiritual education. Now each of us had to read 3 chapters of the Bible every day and memorize a verse to recite at our family devotions every morning. I took it in stride, but Tom drew me aside one day soon into the summer and says, "Dave, how do you put up with this? All this Bible reading, going to church every day?" I didn't know how to respond, but I thought, he's right. Why do I do all this? And the next morning, I didn't have a Bible verse ready. That was defiance. My mom asked me if I was ready for a spanking, and I said no, but I still didn't agree to read the Bible. And my dad gave me 5 minutes to apologize and come up with a verse to memorize while he went looking for something to punish me with. When he returned, I still didn't relent, so he and my mom shepherded me into their back room while Tom and the rest of the kids stayed out in the front room, listening through the cracks in the walls. My dad gave me one more chance, but Tom had already encouraged me not to cry, to stand strong. So I stood strong. I was 14. My dad told me to take down my pants and bend over the bed, and I did. And man, that stick came down hard on my bare butt, on my legs. I writhed, I twisted, tried to get out of the way, but still the stick fell. I lost my resolve after the third stroke and screamed from the pain, and still the stick fell, and I was struggling to get out of the way, but there was no place to go. When that punishment finally stopped, I was sobbing so uncontrollably I could hardly breathe, and blood ran down my legs. Okay, you can pull your pants back up now, my dad told me. I did. Are you ready to apologize and read the Bible? We can keep this up. Mom has medicines for your legs if you need it, but we want to get one thing straight. We want you to know we love you, but this disobedience has to stop. I looked back at the two of them, angry at myself for letting Tom down, for crying during my punishment, completely embarrassed that Tom had heard the whole thing. But I nodded and apologized. That's okay, my dad told me. We love you. Here, come give us a hug. I hugged them, but my heart was cold as ice. There was no way I could love that they loved me, and I hated them. A couple minutes later, I was out among the trees with Tom as he was examining the damage on my legs, and he said, "Man, I'm so sorry, Dave. If I'd realized that was going to happen, I'd never have said a thing. If we were in the States, you could run away. You could get them put in jail." My parents thought the issue was resolved, but my anger just kept on growing. I kept casting around for ways to get even with them. Every time I saw my parents, my heart would freeze, even in the middle of some adventure. Tom and I swam across that great river several times over the next summer, over the next weeks, but still my anger grew. The river flooded near the end of the summer, and we watched houses float down that river several times a day for a week. We went back to Loma Linda, where I got to hang out around the airplanes I loved, but I still nursed my anger, so much so that I completely missed how my dad stood up for me when I got caught stealing motorcycles for a Halloween prank one night. I thought he was going to beat me again. But it wasn't until years later that I realized the main reason my parents ever punished us so severely was for crossing them. My brother Bob got it when he was 17, but almost. He told my dad, "No, you can't beat me. I can run faster than you." But Frank and Jim got it for swinging from a vine that my parents had forbidden them. Now, to be fair, my parents had both grown up around alcoholics, and maybe they used their religion as their addiction, jumping into being missionaries and missionary work before they really even got solid in their faith. But my anger just kept on consuming me until one day I had a flash of insight. I'd become an astrologer. That'd show them. I didn't know much about astrology, but I knew it was terrible. And I knew that getting into astrology would hurt my parents beyond belief. And I finally graduated high school and found myself on my own back in the States. And with my new freedom, I investigated avenues I had never known existed. Yeah, I learned astrology, and it took me years before I learned how to use it for fancy things like timing my investments. You can do that. Meanwhile, I found something even better, the Rosicrucian Order. They promised to teach me how to develop my psychic powers, to master my life on a mystical level, and telepathy and psychic projection. Awesome stuff. I had to know these things. Now, why hadn't I asked the shaman back on the river in Putumayo to teach me his stuff? Because these things scared me too. Astrology was cerebral, and I was only going to use it in the future sometime to get even with my parents, but joining the Rosicrucian Order meant throwing myself headlong into an abyss and doing it now. I stood on the edge, weighing my choices. The Rosicrucians offered so much, but it was my very soul I risked. And then another verse popped into my head, just like when I was 2. This was John 6:37. And it told me that no matter how bad anyone can ever be, if you repent and ask God, he'll always take you back. So I grabbed hold of that verse and I held on tight and I dove over that cliff. It was like that verse was my bungee cord or my lifeline. Now today, it's a whole lot easier. All you have to do is go online to rosicrucian.org and click a few buttons. But back then, I was sure I was throwing my soul to the devil. It didn't take me long to realize my fears had been groundless. I found I'd joined an organization very like the Jedi Knights. Well, without the lightsabers. Okay, Yoda would have said I was too old and too angry, but the Rosicrucians fed my thirst for knowledge, for mystical tools, and for arcane wisdom. And they transmuted my anger into a quiet power that actually built on all my parents had taught me. And as I learned and understood more, I got excited and decided, I'll write home about it. My parents wrote back, "This scares us, son. These people are of the devil. Come back to Jesus." I wrote more letters. They said, "David, they seem like nice people, but they're wrong. Come back to Jesus." "I can't come back now," I wrote back. "You beat it out of me when I was 14. "Oh yeah, we remember that," they wrote back. "And we forgive you. Come back to Jesus." My dad believed in his God so deeply that he was willing to give his life for his Lord at every step of the way. But he led a charmed life, and even though the guerrillas hunted him, they never touched him. Now, he never stopped believing I was headed for hell. Though he never really had the success with the Indians that he'd wanted, maybe he was too busy telling them they were wrong. He never resolved an argument he'd had with a shaman one day about whether the boa was the devil. But he did complete the Siona New Testament, and there's a copy of it and some of his other work in the Smithsonian today. Now, over the years, I investigated a few other New Age groups, but my parents always told me I was wrong. They finished their work in Colombia and moved to Egypt, where they acquired a wealth of information that today helps all kinds of people interface with the Arab culture. They did run against a law that said the only thing that could be written in classical Arabic was the Quran. No translation available there. They finally retired and came back to the States, but now I felt their pressure even more. And eventually I gave up trying to convince them that I was okay spiritually. And rather than continue putting up with what I thought was abuse, I just shut them out of my life entirely. And I kept them out for nearly 4 years. Then one day I got a call from one of my brothers. My dad, over 80 now, was in a hospital in California, probably for the last time. I told my Rosicrucian friends here in Springs about it, and we sat down to meditate. And almost immediately, I found myself in my dad's hospital room. And this was the clearest, most vivid psychic projection I'd ever had. I saw my dad in his bed. And he saw me and invited me closer, and I came and took his hand, and together we drifted out of the room off into some spiritual realm that only the two of us could see. And there we communed. And we learned from each other everything we've been trying to tell each other over the years. And I found that though I'd known that he'd been angry when he'd been beating me that day, it was because he was afraid the devil would get to me. And now I felt that knowledge deep in my entire being. And all the anger I'd ever felt for him just melted away and replaced with understanding and love. And I realized then that yes, my parents had always loved me, regardless of the ways they often expressed that love. I can't excuse them for their abuse, but I do know I can forgive them and that they loved me. After all, I have had a great many more adventures than abuse. And my dad passed away 5 weeks later, but now I was right with him. It took me a little longer to reconcile with the rest of my family, but now I communicate with my mom and my siblings, who even as spread out as we are. I've got a brother, Bob, who's a very Christian carpenter up in Alaska. My brother Frank killed himself 19 years ago. And Jim's a Presbyterian minister out in the Bay Area who remarried after his first wife of 10 years divorced him for her lesbian lover. And Ben, the atheist, is finally getting married for the first time in Texas. He's almost 44. And Linda, his twin sister, the youngest, is a third grade teacher out in the Santa Barbara area who lives with her family there. And each of us has unique stories to tell of our lives and of love, and how sometimes we've let fear block our love. See, now I understand that anybody can be afraid. I still experience the occasional fear as I step to new precipices, and I do a lot of precipices. But now, in addition to realizing I'm loved, I have tools I can use to transmute any fear into something useful. You might not have to go wrestle a 22-foot anaconda right away, but you probably have one or two fears of your own. And I'm a coach, and I've found that any fear can be mitigated. You can block your fear and then not feel love or be loved, but just about any fear you have can be thought of as your body's way of telling you that an adventure is about to begin. And if you accept an adventure, you open yourself wide up for just about anything, including love. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.